Now we're going to move on to talk about Michelangelo. And Michelangelo was Michelangelo, and he had a last name, Buonarroti, but again, we never really talk about, his last name. So this is another artist that we typically call by their first name, even though he does have, a last name we can recognize. This is why later when we talk about Caravaggio, I'll bring up the fact that Caravaggio was a nickname because his name was Michelangelo as well. He was Michelangelo Merisi. So, Michelangelo is a fairly typical name like Leonardo of the time. But, again, this is probably the most famous, right, of the Michelangelos. So he gets to stand alone. Michelangelo thought of himself as a sculptor. And that is why I gave you that slide of Leonardo talking about painting versus sculpture. And Leonardo, of course, is being a little snooty about sculpture. Michelangelo would have been snooty back. He was a bit younger than Leonardo, so when we kind of look through the biographies of the time, it seems to be suggested that Michelangelo kind of thought of Leonardo as kind of like this older gentleman and maybe sort of out of touch, might one say. Where, art historians, we kind of look at Leonardo and say he's a refined older gentleman with lots of, learning and such. I think Michelangelo would have been like, I'm the new wave of things. Like, I don't need to listen to this old guy. There was some tension, it seems, between them about their skill level, their crafts and such. And Michelangelo was said to have been kind of a brutish guy, like kind of no manners, no class in a lot of ways. He kind of did his own thing. He was very much a loner. So I always say that when I talk about the high Renaissance artists, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, they all have their distinct personalities, right? This sort of distinct way their biography crafts our vision of them. And with Michelangelo, it tended to be like he was kind of a bad boy. He didn't really, do what was expected of him. And again, he thought of himself as a sculptor. He would have said to Leonardo, sculpting is the higher art form because I look at a rock, a stone, and I conceive of something inside of it. I make it come to life. If you actually read his journals, Michelangelo was like, I create life, from something inanimate. Very bold statement to make in Catholic Italy at this time. So, again, they would have had sort of different understandings of their talents and their crafts. But Michelangelo always thought of himself as a sculptor, which leads us to discussing, of course, his most famous sculpture, which is the David. And you'll notice that this David is a different vision than we saw with Donatello's, and I'll show you kind of a compare-contrast slide of that so we can think a little bit about the differences between the two, because there's a lot of things that are different here. But to me, what Michelangelo tried to do is he tried to replicate sort of the classic Greek understanding of a sculpture, that he wanted to create this almost Praxiteles or Polycleidian, kind of vision. If you've taken Art History 1, you know Praxiteles and Polycleitus and Myron and all these artists. If you don't, you can Google them, right? But I think what he was trying to do is give a very Greek sort of look, right? A very sort of classical look to his piece in that Renaissance vein or that Renaissance fashion. So many people don't know that originally David was not supposed to be seen in the location that we kind of talk about it being seen in. Originally, it was conceived of and commissioned for the Florence Cathedral. And it was meant to stand on a plinth kind of up out of the air, right? Up in the air. So that's why I gave you the shot on the left of kind of looking up at the cathedral. It was going to be on this plinth, and a plinth is something that supports a sculpture. So if you look to the right, you'll notice that the sculptures have this base below them. We call that a plinth, P-L-I-N-T-H, plinth. So it was supposed to be way up on the cathedral. You're supposed to be like kind of looking up at it. People liked it so much that they wanted it to be in the town square. So if you look to the right, you'll notice that today you see it here in the context of the town square. However, this one is a replica. The actual David, of course, is in the Accademia Museum. This is a replica that's today in the Florence town square. But understanding the context that it was supposed to be up on this plinth high up in the air and the way we were supposed to view it helps you understand when you look at David and realize like, his hands look too big. He looks kind of out of proportion. Maybe Michelangelo made some mistakes. He didn't make any mistakes. what happened was his patrons changed the context of how you would view the piece, resulting in sort of these overly large hands and such, because we were supposed to be looking up at it, not straight on. And again, you can notice it's in the Academia, so you'll see the setting, behind it for the actual real sculpture. I also want to talk about the compare and the contrast, of course, between, Donatello's version and Michelangelo's version. In Donatello's version, we talked about it's a very youthful young boy, very feminized in a lot of ways. And I'd say that Michelangelo's version is none of those things. He's very much a masculinized figure. He's not youthful to me. He's sort of prime, of his life, masculine, probably mid-20s, sort of this very sort of typical athletic figure. So again, there's a huge difference between what Donatello was doing and what Michelangelo was doing with the look of the statue and the feel of the statue. They also picked two different narrative points. Donatello's, you'll remember, is at the end of the story where he's defeated Goliath and has decapitated him. What we're seeing with Michelangelo is it's the beginning of the story where he's holding the slingshot to his shoulder and he's contemplating, in a sense, his movement or his action, what he's going to do. And many art historians say that this is a true Renaissance kind of envisioning of the statue, someone who's looking and thinking and considering that those were all Renaissance values, to be a thinker, a muser on things. So many people interpret that, it's a Renaissance David in a sense. And it's an interesting theory, right, about the piece. Even the materials are different. With Donatello, he was using bronze, which is how the Greeks originally did make their statues. And with Michelangelo, of course, he's using marble, which is usually how the Romans copied Greek statues. But it's the way that most of us actually have seen Greek statues. So if we don't have a lot of art historical background, we think, marble was very typical as a Greek material, which usually wasn't. So they're kind of both kind of playing with what we expect of the Greeks or what we know of the Greeks, but in different ways, I think, as well. But again, a great example of Michelangelo bringing to life, right, something out of the marble. It was said that he used to stand in his workshop and just stare at the marble for like days, weeks. He would just stand there and stare at a piece of marble. Again, whether this is, an urban legend or not, who knows, but it's quite compelling if you want to talk about biographical method, right, of art history. This idea of this man just standing, obsessed, staring at this piece of marble. That's part of his biography. Part of what we talk about is almost him like a wizard kind of bringing this thing to life from the marble. But one of Michelangelo's most famous project, of course, is the Sistine Chapel, where the Pope said, I need you to come paint for me. Michelangelo said, no, I'm not a painter, I'm a sculptor. And he tried to leave Rome and go back to Florence, where he was originally from. Again, thinking back to the David statue, what's his connection there? Well, he's originally a Florentine, but he lived most of his life in Rome because of the patrons that lived there and the Pope as well. So he tried to leave Rome and he tried to go back to Florence to reject the Pope's request, which shows he was kind of a fiery dude. He was like, no, I'm not going to do what you say. The Pope sent his guard, what's called the Swiss Guard, to go get him, basically, and said to the people of Florence, because they were a walled city, still are a walled city, he said, I'll starve everybody else in this city unless you make him come out and go back to Rome with me. So, Michelangelo kind of had to sulk out and slink on out and sulkily, go back to Rome. But this was not a project he was excited about. And not a project he was interested in doing at all. And I gave you a poem he wrote in his journals, and I can assume you've read the poem and you can see that he was not too excited about his experience at the Sistine Chapel. These paintings are fresco paintings, and so they're actually painted with wet plaster onto the walls, and they become a permanent part of the walls. That's how fresco painting works. So you mix plaster and pigment, and then you apply it to the walls. It's a very involved process. You can only really paint half of the year, because if it's too humid or too wet, the fresco won't dry properly. You can imagine fresco painting would not be popular in Florida. It's very humid here. So it's something you see in a lot more of dry climates, or if it's being done in a climate that varies between the two, artists typically wait to the drier seasons, right, to paint, because they understand how fresco dries. So we jokingly say that, the Sistine Chapel was painted in 5 years, but really it was more like 2.5 years. And it speaks to the fact that Michelangelo wanted to get this done and get out under the thumb of the Pope. And the Pope in this case was Pope Julius II, who requested that he come here and paint. One of the things, that Julius would do often is say, okay, you do this for me and I'll give you a couple things you want. Later, when we were talking about mannerism, we'll talk about how another Pope wanted him to come back and paint, the back wall of the Sistine Chapel, and basically traded with Michelangelo, like, well, you can carve the sculptures for my tomb. So, a lot of trades went on with these popes where they were like, okay, I know you don't want to do this, but, I'll offer something else up that you might want in order to sweeten the pot or sweeten the deal a little bit. Another thing while we're looking up at the ceiling in this fashion that I wanted to mention is the ceiling is flat. Everything you see that looks like, curving, that's all been done by the painting. It's all illusion, which is pretty amazing. And there's no architectural elements. So when you're looking up there and you're seeing kind of these architectural elements that look like columns or brackets and such, that's all illusion as well. It's all painted. It's a flat ceiling completely that's been made to look like it curves and looks like it has architectural elements. It's pretty amazing. The narrative reads from the bottom to the top. It starts with the creation of the universe in a sense. God separating the light and the dark, creating the sun, the moon, the stars and such, the creation of man, and then down through the Garden of Eden to the flood. So if you read from bottom to top, you'll notice that each of the panels moves from, creation to the flood. It's Genesis stories, basically. And then on the sides, you have various prophets and sibyls. Sibyls are the female versions of prophets, who are basically arrayed around the storyline. So that's the narrative that you see. Some misconceptions that come up is how Michelangelo painted this. He often is depicted as kind of laying on his back with paint dripping in his eyes. It's very romantic, but that's not the truth. You can look at his journal and see how he kind of did a little sketch of himself. And by the way, the poem that you saw on the first slide, that's the poem written out in his hand, right, in the Italian of the time. So yeah, that's what you see written there. But you'll notice he's standing and he's painting. And then also, for a long time, a lot of people thought that Renaissance artwork had darker colors. I remember when I did my undergraduate at George Washington, a lot of the Renaissance art historians were like, they'd say things to us like jewel-like tones, reds and rubies and, sapphires and stuff, these darker jewel-like tones. And then they started cleaning a lot of these paintings, like you see in the image, and they started to go, oh crap. Oh, they're pastels and these beautiful colors. Basically, they were dirty. All this candle smoke and soot had coated the paintings to the point where they looked like they were darker paintings. This is why I always say that you can't just think that what you learn in art history might never change. We find new things out and then it alters our perception of what's going on here. So those are some famous misconceptions. I pulled a couple different fresco panels just to show you. Of course, you can't get by without seeing the famous Creation of Man. It's probably the most famous one. And many people believe that because Michelangelo didn't actually want to paint here, that he hid little kind of either things that are considered kind of blasphemous. And blasphemy is like something against the church, something that you're like, oh, I can't believe they said that about God, or he just hid things that were kind of sexualized or, that he was poking a little bit at the Pope and poking a little bit at the church without being too obvious about it. In the Creation of Man, for instance, people talk about how this is supposed to be God creating man, but Adam is already animated, he's awake, he's looking at God, and he's very lazy. He's kind of like hanging his hand out there like, I can't be bothered, come closer, so, this idea of God creating man or, man creating God, many people think Michelangelo, just like Leonardo, questioned the church. what was the church really about? So he seems to be saying here, what came first, the chicken or the egg? You know, did man create God or did God create man? That's a pretty blasphemous position if you're in a religious society. There's also in this, you'll notice, this idea of God kind of sailing in on what your logical mind just kind of goes as a cloud, but then when you look further, you're like, wait a minute, it's not really a cloud. What the heck is that thing? Many people talk about it looks kind of like a brain cut in half, and that maybe there's this idea of like we thought up God. The brain of man thinks up God. We need something to, say, oh, we came from somewhere. Again, it's a fairly blasphemous position. And then people talk about how the arm of God goes behind this female figure and touches this boy and then kind of moves towards Adam. And some people suggest that Adam's sin resulted in Christ's sacrifice and that the little baby's kind of thought to be Christ, Virgin Mary, and then over to Adam again. Again, these are theories, but they're all very interesting theories. Here's some more obvious ones. The creation of the sun, moon, and the planets. I would say, do you really expect to see God's butt? I don't. So many people think that, the Pope probably came by to see Michelangelo's progress, and he's like, hey, I did this one, and the Pope probably just looked up like, is that God's butt? That's really God's butt, isn't it? And probably looked at Michelangelo like, what the? And Michelangelo's kind of like snorting a little bit, like, laughing. It's not enough to change the whole painting, right? But if you think about it, that's a nice butt on God. I mean, he's been doing his squats. So there's just these little things that people think he hid in the paintings. I won't even say anything here. You can just use your eyes about the placement of Eve and Adam in the left-hand part of this image. So many people are like, yeah, I think there's a couple things here that you're like, well, okay, Then Michelangelo, in a sense, was trying to get under the skin of the Pope, perhaps, when making these frescoes, and wasn't exactly maybe so innocent about his reasons. Here's a nice tile just showing you a couple different images. On the right, you have some of the Sibyls, and you'll notice that created architecture that Michelangelo painted. And on the left, you have the flood. Of course, you have God's butt up again. Can't avoid that one, right? The last artist we're going to talk about is Raphael in your final video.